Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to this Wednesday evening. Slightly later than normal because I think David had to put his kids to bed, something like that. But thank you very much for giving up your time and joining us. It's being recorded as well, so I completely understand if you have to pop out and cook your dinner or something at the same time. But hopefully you'll learn a lot from today, or at least you'll hear me and David agreeing with each other wholeheartedly over the state of affairs. David, thanks very much for joining us again.
Always a pleasure, Jason. It must mean that the summer is here. The test matches are about to start if we're doing this again. So it's always an exciting time of year.
Yeah, I mean, surely you'd rather be doing this than sitting at a test match.
I think there's a reason why you and I get on so well, and our mutual love of cricket is probably part of that.
Well, one of the wonderful things about cricket is that you can sit there and talk all day at the same time. David, for those of you who, or for those attending who might not know who you are, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking at the list now and think probably people do, but for people watching back, my name is David Hawkins. I'm the founder and one of the directors of the University Guys, a team of independent educational consultants helping students cross borders for their university experience. And we are great friends with the team at UES, both professionally and personally, and it's always a pleasure to collaborate.
The feeling is mutual. Thank you very much for joining us, David. Right, I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. See if I can remember how to do this. That was great. Hopefully everyone can see that. Okay, so we're going to talk a bit about what happened in the last round, as in the round that's just finished. It's not quite finished, though, because there are still some people waiting for places at college and some people who might suddenly change their mind at the last minute. But for the most part, people who applied to universities last autumn mostly know where they're going this coming autumn. So we're going to talk about that round, what happened, what was new, what changed, and we're going to make some silly predictions for the next round as well. A little bit about UES. We are just over 10 years old. Can't believe that. David came to our 10th anniversary party the other day. It's been a quick 10 years, but we're really pleased that we're still going strong and helping more people than ever. Like David, we help with all aspects of the US applications, including the very, very boring bit of SAT and ACT tutoring, work with lots of schools. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what happened in the last round, and that includes admit rates, deferrals, wait lists, that sort of thing. We'll talk a bit about the trends that are happening in the US, but not just the US, also in Europe and the UK. Talk about the dreaded topic of university rankings and why you probably shouldn't think about them too much. And can't do a webinar without talking about the SAT. So we'll talk a little bit about that, why that's happened, and some statistics related to that. Make some predictions about what will happen the next round. And we'll sum it up by talking about what students and families should really be thinking about when they're applying to university. Okay, Dave and I are going to do this like a conversation, and David's going to hit me with loads of statistics that he's probably got ready. I've got some ready as well. But David, admit rates, especially in the US, what has happened here?
It's the sort of the vicious cycle effect is really coming to bear, and I think we might touch on information about sort of Northeastern University later on, which is kind of indicative of this situation. And it is almost the race to the bottom in many cases, that as we see year on year, more universities become more competitive, and we become immune to this idea of, well, that university only takes 3% of people to apply, or 5% or 7% of this. Those are normal figures, and yet when you actually think about it, the vast majority of people who apply don't get in. And perfectly naturally, students who only want to go to university in the United States feel they have to apply to more places to cover themselves. And what maybe 15 years ago for a student with those grades might have been a safety or a backup university now becomes a likely university, and a likely university becomes a reach university. And we're now using the term super reach. It's even beyond a reach university, it's on top of that. And then the next year students feel, well, I have to apply to more, and it becomes this sense of, well, we are racing to the sense of the difficulty of it. The pure and simple fact is most US universities, though not all of them at the most selective end of it, are becoming statistically harder to get into. And it's not just like, oh, it's a little bit hard. It's a bit like me deciding I'd like to play in the Ashes on Friday. It's hard to the point of being completely unrealistic for many students, which is really tough.
Well, Leach is out, so if you spin a ball, you can play. Yeah, I agree with you. I think one of the things that we find quite difficult is that things change very rapidly in admit rates and probabilities of getting into college in the US. People's understanding, particularly parents' understanding of what is reach and what is match, doesn't change as quickly. And you mentioned Northeastern. It wasn't long ago, certainly in current students' parents' era, Northeastern was not seen as a reach college. It wasn't a reach college. It was much more likely that international students would get in. NYU is another one. People still think of that as a match university, but it's very, very long way from that now, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, and I remember going back to 11, 12 years ago, the first kind of group of students I counseled into this. I have a student in my head who I can picture, who was a high 20s IB, and he got into Northeastern fairly straightforwardly. And kudos to them for playing the game that they've done so. But there's just absolutely no chance I would even consider that student looking at Northeastern now. And that mismatch of expectations, and we'll talk about more of that when we look at the UK context in a bit, is a real challenge, because it's very quickly transformed the situation of more colleges slipping into this rejective category that Akil Bello from Fair Test coins. Almost everybody who applies can't get in. It's really complicated. What I will say, and I think again we're touching this later in, there seems to be some educational narrative in the mainstream media in the US about this and the issue of this, and is this a good thing? So we might get to a situation where actually it may get the other way. And some colleges were static this year in terms of their admit rates, which is a good sign that actually there may not be pressure from within those communities to keep rejecting more and more students, that actually we've hit a point and we're perfectly happy with that.
The ones that are already at 0% aren't going any further down, you mean?
Well, yeah, possibly. Yeah. I mean, there's the old article from The Onion a couple of years ago that Stanford would become so selective that nobody gets in. I mean,
and no one thought it was a joke either.
Well, quite. So,
and part of this is driven by students applying to more colleges, and this is part of that vicious cycle you talked about, where students are worried about getting in, so they apply to more places. And because they're applying to more places, the admit rates across those places go down because they're receiving more applications. Have you seen a big increase in the number of colleges that people choose?
For students who absolutely want to be in the US, I wouldn't say that we're seeing the number of applications go up, but we are seeing students build a slightly broader list, and being quite thoughtful about the different application plans in there. It has become a bit tricky with early action, and some universities, because of the volume of applications, no longer notify people that they've been admitted early action until after January the 1st, which can be a bit tricky. But you can find, in fact, I was speaking to a student of ours earlier today about this, really kind of solid university options where a student can apply early, be admitted in December, and actually feel safe, feel secure about that kind of stuff. Historically, UCAS might have played that well for some students as well, and that's become a bit trickier with the timelines there as well. But we certainly have students with bigger lists going forwards, but it's almost a bit like a make your own adventure story that, well, if this, then this, then this. Now, hopefully, if we all do a good job as advisors, then you won't need to get to, oh, well, I didn't get into. Up at the University of Connecticut, as an example, for example, we have a number of students for whom they like that style of university. Big public universities. UConn's a great school, but it doesn't necessarily have that brand reputation. It's kind of almost like a hidden gem. People forget that it's there. A lot of students can get into UConn with rolling admissions fairly nicely, and possibly with a decent chunk of scholarship money. So we've had a number of students use that kind of university early in the cycle, which actually then means if by late November you're in there, then the other 8 colleges that maybe you had on your list that are the same or maybe not as attractive to you as that university can drop off. But I think the context that we're all dealing with here in the UK is that the students also have UCAS typically. Whereas if I was advising students and I was at an American high school, then clearly you just have to cover all eventualities. You are hedging, really. And
you talk about early applications there. That's something that has for many reasons become much more important. It's not always something that's going to increase the probability of people getting in, though, right? Early decision definitely does. But I think there is sometimes a misconception that early action means that students are more likely to be admitted. What do you say to students who that are really determined to apply everywhere early?
Yeah, I mean, you need to look at the data really as to how it affects, and I'd say with the Ivies also have that slight skepticism that the data also includes athletes, and also if they still do it, legacies. So it can skew the data. If all the athletes and all the students with legacy are told to apply early, well, then it's going to make the admit rate look more generous than it might be if you don't have one of those hooks.
Yeah.
And again, it's the race to the bottom here. There's more students think I have to apply early, then I have to apply earlier in order to give myself the chances for it. And it's almost like, well, do we have the early application coming on stream soon? I think there's advantages to doing it for a student who's ready and who has considered everything and can definitely get some going. And if you are absolutely ready and everything's sorted and you've worked hard over the summer, then submitting a bunch of places in early is a good idea.
Yeah.
But equally, there might be the workload or the pastoral conversation to be had with the people involved in the student's life of actually, you might not want to do all these extra supplemental essays. It comes back to what I was saying about a university like the University of Connecticut. If that's a place you're happy to go to and it's pretty likely you can cure that fairly early, then why are we doing another 15 bunches of essays when we probably don't need to do those?
Yeah.
So it's that, but it definitely seems to be more common currency within a UK community for this, that early is the way to go. And I assume that's something to do with Reddit, which I stay away from, but lots of people will be, I'm assuming, on there saying this is what you have to do.
Yeah, I agree. And you touched on something earlier which really resonated, which was that because of the number of applications that universities are getting, they can no longer all give decisions in December before people submit their regular decisions. And you might find, I mean, I had a student last year who applied, I think, to 8 colleges early. Brilliant. She was prepared, ready. But there were, because of the various rules around early action and stuff, there were some colleges she had to apply to regular. But she had to apply to them because we didn't have all the decisions from the early ones yet, which meant that even though it was quite likely she was going to be admitted somewhere early, and therefore wouldn't have needed to apply to the regular ones, she had to apply to the regular ones because we just didn't know yet. So it did mean an extra, in her case, I think 7 applications regular, because we just weren't sure if any of the 8 would definitely come through. They did in the end, but it does mean that suddenly there's a lot more work because things are not happening as early on the university end as they are on the student's end.
And it's a processing issue, and those of us who follow the educational press in the States will know there are issues with recruiting staff into admissions. There's some stat, it's something like 70 or 80% of the people working in US college admissions offices have been there for 3 years or less, which is a huge issue. And so the processing and the time, this kind of stuff, if you've got, you used to have X number of applications that Y number of staff had to process in Z number of days, and now you've got X plus 20%, it's going to take you longer to do it.
Well, I mean, yeah, we know that UCLA topped 150,000 applications, haven't they? They've got to read the essays. That's a lot of essays.
Yeah.
Test taking, always something that worries people, especially internationally, and it's got more and more confusing because of the fact that almost everywhere is test optional. That doesn't mean that you just do it if you like. It means you might do it, you might not. You might submit the scores, you might not. You'll submit them somewhere, might not submit them everywhere. Sometimes they super score, sometimes they don't. Sometimes you require all the scores, just to kind of sum it up. So it's got very confusing. In our experience at UES, depending on when people come to us for support, if it's very late, we might say, look, it's probably not the best thing to do. If it's very early, we normally say, probably you need to assume that you're going to do a test because we're not sure where you're going to be applying yet or what the rules for that university will be by the time you apply. Does that roughly sum it up for you?
I think so. And the only other bit I'd add is, and this is something I know you've got your colleague Dan's stats on a bit later on, but the SAT is now a little bit more palatable in terms of the formatting of the test, predominantly how long it takes.
Yeah.
And actually, I think it's slightly less intimidating than maybe it was before.
Mm.
So it just doesn't feel like as much of a mission as maybe it did before. And so
Yeah.
I think students, knowing that it can be important and looking at the colleges where it is important, don't feel quite as put off about it as they might have done when it was the sort of sit down for, well, some stretching into 5 hours if it was a really slow test centre. It can be quite efficient now.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not perfect yet, but it's certainly a much bigger improvement over the old one, and it's definitely an improvement over the ACT. We'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Deferrals and wait lists. Obviously, we don't have all the data on this for this round yet because there are still people on the wait list. Did you notice any change in number of people being deferred from the early round to the regular round?
Yeah, it's something. It was a little trend of it last year for a couple of students, and I think more so this year. And we were saying before we started that Jeff Salingo did a great article on this, which will be in back issues of the UES and the University Guides newsletters, probably from sort of March sometime. Kind of unpicking some of this and the data points on it. Waitlists are obviously there for the universities to hedge meeting capacity. And it's the same in any university system that is selective around the world. You want to make enough offers to come in just below capacity, so that then you can go to whatever your waitlist is, in the UCAS near miss offer holders and the US formal waitlist to top up to capacity. Universities, their capacity issues are complicated by all sorts of factors, least alone the economic issues right now. And so by putting more people on it, even early in the cycle from an early application, gives you more opportunities to do that. But it's designed for the universities. It's that kind of potentially false hope. And it's why Jeff's article, I think, is so interesting, because it really unpacks some of the numbers behind this. There are some colleges are putting more students on wait lists than they actually are admitting to the university in the entire year. But the way I always try and articulate to families is if you are, a home county's privately educated student who plays sports and is really interested in business, well, if they lose a student who is really STEM focused, who likes coding and gaming and comes from another part of the world, well, they're not replacing them with you. So the way this have to have all sorts of different types of students on there so that they can keep that kind of well-constructed class of students that they're trying to bring in.
Yeah. Yeah. And deferrals are never simple either, because sometimes, most of the time our message is, look, a deferral is good. It means that you're definitely not out, but you shouldn't really assume that you've got much more of a chance in the next round. Sometimes it's a bit odd. USC, for instance, this was the first round that they had early action, and they didn't reject anyone in that round and deferred anyone they didn't immediately admit. So in that case, it being deferred, you can't tell whether or not you would have been rejected or not.
Yeah.
So it does make things a bit more complicated there. Let's talk a little bit about rankings. In fact, we're going to have a slide on this, but very broadly, there's been a little bit of a shake-up, or rather than a shake-up, there's been a bit of mumblings about rankings, haven't there?
Yes, and I think it kind of started off in one professor's office in New York last year, and the little ripples are spreading in a way that's quite interesting. But again, what we as geeks for this stuff have known for a number of years seems to be seeping out into sort of more regular conversation in a way which I think can only be a good thing. Of rankings are designed for commercial purposes.
Yeah.
And the rankings need to look the way we expect rankings to look like, and so they look like the way we want them to look like.
Yeah.
Until some universities decide to be quite brave and say, well, actually, we don't want to be part of this.
Yeah. We'll talk about more of that in a moment. And there's a lot of anxiety about UK unis. I think it's probably worth addressing that in a moment as well. Just talking about the broader trends. Let's do that now. Why are people worried about UK unis, David?
Yeah, so this is something we spent a lot of time talking to sort of various schools and school groups and school leaders about, and it's a combination of a number of different factors. Now, the obvious thing that you'll see in the newspapers is COVID. Well, not really. The issue with UK unis is, to put it down very simply, is capacity. There are more students in the system, but there are not more spots at every university. And if you put it break it down to very simple terms, if there are 5% more students leaving school each year, which there are, that doesn't mean that each university gets 5% bigger. it means that yeah, there are more students competing for the same kind of places, and therefore it's going to get hard to get into it. And best is not a fixed concept. We don't have a system like public universities in Europe where you cross this academic threshold and you can go. Best is a moving thing. And so you find a situation where Oxford, in their admissions report that came out a week or so ago, said that something like 66% of the students who they admitted last year had 3 A stars or better at A level. The problem is that we have a generation of parents and indeed some teachers for whom 3 A's was Oxford grades. Now, there's a significant difference between 3 A's and 3 A stars and 3 A stars or better. And that's the challenge, is that very simply, students can't get into the same universities that they probably would have been able to get into with those grades had they applied 3, 5, 10, 15 years ago. Now, the reasons behind that are demographics. There's issues with university finances. If the £9,250 UK tuition fee for home fees had gone up in inflation as it's supposed to have done, were it not politically completely unpalatable, it would be about £13,000 now. So universities are a third worth off for every UK student that they take than they were before. Plus, we have then issues with widening participation targets, which are wonderful things to do. But you look at now some of the schools that are sending huge numbers of students to the most selective universities. Some of those schools did not exist a decade ago. So there's a whole different swathe of people there as well. And universities, whether you think it's right or not, I tend to think it is, looking at context of students' educational achievement. When you boil it down, you have parents who think, my child should be able to get to this university. They can't. Therefore, we're going to look somewhere else. And somewhere else tends to be America, because they swallow some of the media narrative about, oh, can't get into Oxford, go to Harvard. Well, if you row, then yes, but otherwise probably not. And that's where the challenge comes from. It's seen that it's much harder to get the place that parents think maybe their child should, and therefore they're going to look somewhere else. They're not necessarily going to go further down the selectivity tables in the UK because they think their child deserves, quote unquote, better.
Yeah, and this has a whole set of repercussions, as you alluded to. Private schools were traditionally very good at getting students into the top UK universities. By virtue of the fact that more people are trying to go and more people are getting top grades, that is now harder to do, and that's somewhat outside of the control of independent schools. It's also compounded by the fact that this funding gap that you talked about has to be plugged by the universities somehow. And therefore, taking in international students is quite good for universities who pay higher fees, much higher than the cap for UK students. And that then means that there are fewer students for fewer places for UK students. So it's a small island, this one, and there's a good number of universities, but not that many places for the number of people in this island. And I think that's why we're seeing more and more people look abroad. A few years ago, after that thing that happened, that I don't know if you remember that thing called Brexit that happened, people got very worried about going to Europe and wondered what that would mean for students. And indeed, there was quite a dip in the number of UK students looking at Europe. That seems to have gone up again. The number of people looking at Europe has increased. Is that the sense that you're seeing as well?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of reasons behind that. And Europe is obviously a term that we in college counselling use for the sake of shorthand, but it's lots of different higher education areas and different types of universities within it. I do think that there has been cut through from some private European universities who've worked extraordinarily hard over a number of years to build their relationships and reputations in the UK. I will declare an interest. Many of you will know my wife, Sheena Mehta, who used to work for IE running their UK office and takes great pride in the work that they did to make them the second most popular international university for students from UK independent schools. So, but IE, Bocconi, Lyon, Les Roches, EHL, and new places like Forward College, you came to your conference earlier in the week, Jason, ESCP, those universities have cut through. And a lot of schools in the UK are year after year having a lot of applications to that. So that's kind of your 6th, 7th option in there. Equally, however, and again, it comes back to demographics, there's a ton of students at UK schools with EU passports now. And if we go back in the pre-Brexit days, there was a very significant wave of immigration, very positive, again, I would say, for the UK, but from people from parts of the European Union who moved to the UK in the early 2000s. People settled, got married, had children. Those children went to school, are in every possible way British, but might also have an EU passport. And they're looking around at the UK and going, okay, it's pretty decent funding settlement, £9,250, but my EU passport also allows me to access even cheaper university funds and potentially better deals in the EU as well. And when you look at where some students are going, and obviously hard data is really difficult to find on this, one of the trends is students with EU passports looking to the EU for university, particularly in the maintained school sector, not necessarily the private school sector. So there's things there as well. And then there is that hedging factor of why don't we add Trinity College in Dublin? Or I've heard the Stockholm School of Economics is good. Or what about ETH Zurich? Of your 6th, 7th, 8th option there, because actually, we don't want to add the university of place we would never go to and just drive past on the M1 because we don't think it's good enough for our son. We'd rather have that interesting place in another country. So I think there's that element of it as well.
Yeah, I agree. And I think added to that, some of these colleges like Forward College that you mentioned are adding some quite new and different exciting opportunities for students. Forward College is one that is somewhat of a traveling college where students will move around different campuses in different countries. There are other things like the World Bachelor of Business has been around for a while, but a bit harder to get into at the moment. And other examples like dual programs, like first-year abroad programs, American universities in Europe. Northeastern is making a big waves in London. So there's lots more opportunities for students that are quite exciting that students might not have been aware of and might not have considered before.
Correct.
Okay, let's talk a bit more about rankings. So as you said, some colleges are getting a bit fed up, like we have been for quite a long time, about the rankings and decided not to take part. I do actually, I'm not going to try and risk breaking the screen sharing, so I won't get it up. But there's a great article in the New York Times about the death of college rankings. It's easily Googleable. And that was prompted by a couple of colleges deciding they were no longer going to take part in this game, famously Columbia recently. David, why are they getting fed up? Why don't they want to take part in this anymore?
Yeah, so I think there's probably a couple of sides to this, and this is more speculative than perhaps some of the other stuff that I said earlier. I do think the Columbia thing was really interesting. That for those who haven't looked into it, a professor, I think a professor of maths, but I might be getting that wrong, at Columbia decided to do a little intellectual exercise and delve into the data that was being submitted to US News and World Report for their rankings, and actually found that one of the things that was being submitted was data on the amount of money spent on tuition. You think, well, that's a good way of ranking university, how much money you actually spend on tuition, but they were including the cost of Columbia's medical school, their hospital. So basically the cost of treating patients was being counted towards their cost of tuition. And he had this brilliant expose of basically showing that actually this is a complete load of rubbish, some of this data. Now, from someone within the academic community to say that, that's spread out quite widely, and it's being obviously shared on listservs and email exchanges and WhatsApp to other professors at other universities. And I think the scales fell from many people's eyes when they understood that actually some of this is not quite as rigorous as perhaps we thought it was. So things are moving. Some other colleges, Colorado College, had also kind of, because of the way that their ethos and mission, decided to come out of it. So there's that kind of bubbling away thing. There is then obviously also a kind of sort of like commercial sense, I think, of being an early mover on this. They actually know we are not involved in rankings anymore. Look at us. We don't believe in this. We are pulling back the curtain from the Wizard of Oz and showing you it's not really true. I think there's definitely a little bandwagon starting there, and it's better to be at the start of it, a bit like Chicago and NYU becoming test optional at the start of it. And I think there may be some of that going on as well, which is only positive. The issue is going to be, and anyone who's watched the commercial tie-ups of other ranking sites, some of which have 3 letters as their names, can see that there is a massive commercial reason of how you have ranking sites. So it'd be interesting to see how US News and World Report responds, because that's basically always US News and World Report do now, is that they rank things.
Yeah, and there is nothing stopping these sites continuing to rank Columbia, is there?
Yeah.
If they choose to, they might not have all the data, but then that goes to show that these ranking sites might be ranking things in a way that is not entirely transparent anyway.
Yes.
And this plays into what we really want to warn people about, which is that you've got to be very careful when looking at these rankings, that they're not ranking them on things that you might be interested in and what's important to you, particularly as a student. One thing I've always said to students is when you're looking at rankings, pay attention to what those factors are. Times Higher Education rankings are a really good case in point, where there'll be weightings for things like research output, stuff like that. If research is not important to you as an undergraduate, why are you factoring it into your rankings? Why is it not things like your chances of getting a job 6 months after leaving the college? Why is it not things like the quality of teaching and the experience that you're going to have there? Those are probably things that people consider very important in undergraduate degrees, and there are ways of finding those things out rather than just through these very blunt ranking tools.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about digital SAT. As David said earlier, it has become a much more comfortable test. This is a really good change. People were very worried about what was going to happen when the College Board announced that they were going to change the test again. For those of you old enough to remember, that it changed last time in 2016. In about 2018, the ACT launched their digital test, although the format didn't change. It was on a computer and you have to go to a test center to do it. The SAT has now changed to a digital format as well, but the format has changed a lot. It is shorter, less wordy. So there's fewer long paragraphs that you have to read now. Each question is its own question. You don't get questions related all to the same paragraph in either the maths or the English. On the maths side, you get an embedded calculator. This is a Desmos calculator that is free online anyway, and it's definitely worth playing with. It's a brilliant thing. If you can get used to that, it really changes your experience of the math section, even if you're a really good mathematician. The really nice thing is that it's done on a student's own laptop in a test center. So you go to a school, but you go with your own laptop. So it's very familiar. You preload the software, and when you get to the test center, it automatically starts the test. It's also done slightly asynchronously, which means that if there's a problem with your computer at the start, they've got time to sort it out. It doesn't mean the test is over for you. Compare that to the ACT. You go to a test center, you do it on their computer, everything is preloaded onto their servers beforehand, and if something goes wrong, as it did this weekend, that is it for the test. There's no going back from that. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Try and be
please.
But the other big thing about the SAT is that it's adaptive by section, which means that there are 2 sections of English and 2 sections of math. How well you do in your first section of English determines how hard the second section is. The idea behind this is not new at all. GRE does it, GMAT does it, loads of other tests do it. It allows the test writers to hone in onto your level much more quickly. This is why the test is shorter, but still just as precise in terms of getting your level. And the scoring is still comparable to the old test. So you still get a score out of 800 for English and 800 for math. Much nicer test, much more time per question. It's still fast, about 80 seconds per question, but it used to be about a minute, and it's less than a minute per question on the ACT. So students generally find the SAT a much nicer test. Our data so far shows that about 80 to 90% of UK students are better suited to the SAT than the ACT. The weird thing is that if you can do the ACT, and that's normally students who have got some STEM background, that they're studying maths and science in school normally, and they're very fast processors, so they read very quickly. If you're that kind of student, you can do the SAT anyway. So my prediction last year was that most people would end up doing the SAT. I suspect this is going to come around more rapidly than we thought, because there do seem to be some problems with the ACT. There have been a lot of issues with test centers recently internationally. One of the problems is that these test centers are not owned by the ACT. They are outsourced to other companies, and sometimes things don't go well. And the problem is that if something goes wrong internationally, there's no one around to help. That's the end of the test.
Yeah. And some of them have cancelled, even if not going wrong, have cancelled at very short notice.
Yeah, you turn up on the day, doesn't go ahead, or they move you from one test centre to another. Should be pointed out, in fairness, that these sorts of things happen with the College Board for the SAT, but already it seems to be far fewer times than it happens with the ACT. So my advice to people is, you've got to make sure you're doing the right test first. If you live very close to somewhere like Marlborough, which is an ACT test centre, things might actually be quite easy for you if you're an ACT student. Be careful about accommodation, so that's extra time. Make sure you're getting that on the right test. There is a whole blog on our website about that. There are some factors that mean that ACT might be better for you. So make that decision carefully, but my guess, without knowing anything about the student, would be SAT is normally the best bet. A few trends on that. My colleague Dan, our academic director, put these together for our conference the other day, just to show the number of test takers. Now, before the pandemic, things were going up and up, and it really peaked in 2019, and obviously started dropping down in 2020 and then 2021 significantly because of the pandemic. And things started to rebound last year. We don't have that much data for 2023 yet. Our sense is that numbers are going up quite rapidly, and far more rapidly on the SAT than the ACT. Now, these data are from USA, but you can extrapolate that to the UK for sure. And as I said earlier, I think as students start to prepare earlier and the test is easier to take, testing factors more and more into students' thinking there. Okay, so David, we need to make some predictions for the next cycle. One thing we do know is that more and more colleges are going onto the Common App. I don't know if you heard this or if you knew this, but Catherine from Rutgers said that Rutgers is going to be on the Common App next year. That's a state university in New Jersey, and traditionally state universities all have their own systems. Some still do, especially Florida and California. But last year, University of Texas went onto the Common App. This year, Jersey's going on.
University of Washington last year as well.
Yeah, exactly. So as more go onto the Common App, what happens? More students apply. So let's hope that they know how to deal with the numbers that will be applying suddenly. That means more applications. And do you think the number of applications to US universities is just going to keep increasing?
I mean, in general terms, yes, it will do. You see the data, there is a steady growth from within the US, even though their demographics are actually going the other way to the UK in terms of the number of children coming through the system each year. But there's a massive spike in international stuff. US is a desirable place to study. It's got name brand colleges. Admissions process has become easier. There are more people doing what we do in other parts of the world, encouraging students, making it easier for them to do it. The lack of a testing barrier, making more students think they can do it. So there's definitely a worldwide context. I think in the UK, this has now reached a tipping point. I had an email today from a school, someone who moved from previous school where we worked with them to a new school. Basically, I've been told we have to build an international universities program, help, with like 18 exclamation marks at the end. This is becoming a thing that UK schools need to be able to do. We see the numbers that came to your conference, numbers that came to our conference, your blogs, our blogs, podcasts, all that kind of stuff. More and more UK schools are thinking we need to have that pressure valve to UCAS. Where is it going to be? It's going to be America. Some schools are great and really understand what that means in terms of the workload and stuff for staff. Other schools are a bit naive about it, but it's just more and more and more. I would love to have the kind of understanding of US freedom of information laws to ask the places like Harvard and Yale and Princeton and Stanford what their restrictive early applicant pools look like from the UK and how that trend has gone over 3 or 4 years. Triple-digit percentage growth wouldn't surprise me from what we hear on the ground speaking to schools. Yeah. And so I think there will be more applications. Certainly, every school advisor in the UK will have got said that, maybe we had one every 3 years, now we have 5. Maybe we had 10, now we have 40. Now we have 20, now we have 70. It's only going in that one direction at the moment, and that presents challenges.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm glad you brought up that messaging to schools. I know you and I agree on that. And we're quite honest with schools that, we will help schools, and schools do pay us for support with them, but that is not the ideal solution to this. And as students, particularly independent schools, find it harder and harder to get into those Russell Group and those Oxbridge type universities in the UK, because of the pressure on them, parents will start asking, what is the school's provision for international universities, particularly America? And schools will start to be judged on that. Those schools that are getting ahead of it are starting to see much larger numbers of people applying to the school, because they know that the school can support them with that. And I think that schools should be getting ahead on that, should be honest with themselves about the support that's needed for that. And well, we know it's like musical chairs if you're an international schools counsellor. There are not enough of them to go around, and they will take jobs in Singapore and places like that where they know that people really value what they do. So my suggestion would be, if you are a forward-thinking independent school, you should seriously think about hiring some good people now before other people do, and your rivals get there first.
People with young children who can be given very generous free permissions to stay there for a long time.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, obviously, more applications means lower admit rates. We know that there is a death spiral going on here, and people need to be very careful about, just because your younger sibling got in somewhere last year, doesn't mean that it's going to be as easy next year. So you've got to make sure you've got a good wide list. I do think that more people will be taking tests in the UK as that becomes easier with the SAT, and as people start to think about what they can do to separate themselves academically from other people. Okay, so that's what we think is going to happen. What should families do? Well, the messaging is always start early. Don't leave this until the beginning of year 13. If you are in year 12 now and thinking about applying overseas, it's already starting to get too late. You should be really thinking about where you're going to be applying, starting to think about how to demonstrate interest to those colleges, thinking about starting to write your essays. There's a lot to do. And there's only a couple of weeks left of school. And I'm talking to the students here, you need to be getting ahead and asking your teachers if they might be so kind enough to write you letters of recommendation next term. So start now. And in general, with university admissions, start much earlier than you ever think you need to. Same goes for teachers thinking about helping their students and building programs. You just do yourself a favor if you get them all ahead, starting early. Parents who might be listening, they should be talking to their school, and this plays into that messaging we were just talking about. I don't want to put schools in a difficult position here, but do you agree that parents should be talking to the schools early, asking about what provision they have?
Yeah, I do. And I think it kind of, schools need to be very honest about that kind of communication strategy. It's a challenge for schools in the sense that UCAS has historically been easy. And so we don't have a culture of resourcing university advising in the UK in the same way as other countries have had to do for many, many years. And so then when suddenly someone says, my child wants to go to university in another country, it's hard to understand what that would be. Yeah. But I do think families should be talking to the school, and I think they should be making sure that they ask the right questions of the right people. I think where some schools inadvertently walk into problems is where what's been said and what's been understood on this area are not necessarily the same thing. A school can say in the admissions or marketing departments, when asked, our child wants to go to University of America, can you help with that? And they could genuinely say, well, we know we had a kid go to America last year, so yes, we can.
Yeah.
They don't know whether that child was rowing for Great Britain or playing field hockey for England and was being scouted basically already and got in. They don't know whether the family had people like us kind of involved in things like that. They just maybe know a student went to America. It's no one's fault. It's just that. The problem is then the family expects, potentially an international family, a full service US college counselling thing as if the kid was at sort of Trinity School in New York or Groton or Phillips Exeter. And they're getting someone who's unfortunately quite likely not that. And that's where the challenge comes. It's not just, do you help with American applications? can you help understand our child's own profile, their desire to maybe go for test optional and look at NESCAC schools to build a US list? And if you get blank stares, then you can probably answer that question rather than, can you help us go to America? And then understanding other things like, test prep and essay things. And if your child has to play 5th team tiddlywinks on a Saturday instead of writing the Stanford essays, all those kind of other elements that come into it as well. And I would say for families who may be listening on, have a chat maybe to us offline. There only might be 2 or 3 other people in the country who get to as many schools to speak to the university advising departments as you and I do, Jason. And we can probably tell you, if we had a child who wanted to go to university in America, where might we send them to school if we felt they had the best provision internally? And I say it might not be the schools a lot of people might think it might be, because there's some really great practice happening at places that are quite under the radar.
Quite. One message that I always try and get across to families is that you've got to think widely about lists, and you've got to stop fretting about prestige, and you've got to think about the fit. There are a number of reasons why. I get it from parents. I get that they are worried about how much money they might be spending on university, and they want to get value for money. I think the cost benefit analysis they do is sometimes a bit off, because they are misled by the media and misled by what rankings and things like that tell them, and sometimes misled by seeing the success of friends and friends' children who've gone to those famous universities and then succeeded, and think that's the reason why they've succeeded. But what I really want to try and explain to people is that going to the right fit university, somewhere where you will thrive, somewhere where you will enjoy your time but learn skills that are useful for the future, that is the thing that makes you successful. And it can be sometimes a difficult message to get across, and I know there's a lot of teachers on this call at the moment who probably have to answer these questions from parents all the time, but hopefully by kind of drilling that message home, people will start to listen. Some schools do some great work on this. I know that ASL do that blind college fair, get colleges to come along, but they don't say which colleges they're from, and the students go and talk to them and hear about them, and then say which ones they'd want to go to, and then it's revealed which colleges they are. Is there anything else that you think schools can be doing or parents should be thinking about here when it comes to choosing universities?
Yeah, so I've got something with the schools thing, which I increasingly, when I'm saying this and thinking back to my own practice as a school counsellor, becomes more and more important to me, is that you have the students mostly at your schools. If you're an all-through school, the students are kind of already at your schools. So audit them. Ask their parents, where are you thinking of going to university and what to study? And then I'm sure you've got the data management people in your school somewhere. Look at the data for those students as well, and then sit down with a couple of cups of coffee and some snacks in a conference room and work through it all, maybe with an academic deputy or his assistant head pastoral and whoever it is, and start to see what problems you've got. Blimey, 1/3 of our students in year 10 want to be engineers. How does that translate with their math skills? Well, this group, based on our chem data, is 20% weaker than last year. Well, there's an issue that we can see coming down the pathway, that these kids all want to do A-level maths and we don't think they should be. Or in our case, we got a bunch of EU passport holders. Maybe we need to get a Dutch uni to come and give a talk. Or they all want to go to America. Which universities? It's the Ivy League. Okay, well, let's put in place some programming to deconstruct that. So much of this is reactive, and I understand entirely why it is. Email from a family, we want to go to America, scramble, find a solution. Great. But you have the students. It's not like us, where we're getting inquiries and phone calls and stuff, and suddenly it's like, my application's due in 3 weeks, please help. You have the students in your school community. Find out what they want to do, cross-reference it with information you've got, and then you can put in place your programming to start to make sure the process can become as healthy as it can do. And lean on universities, outside speakers, the great events that UES are doing, the events that we're doing, to try and make sure that you can get that messaging out before it kind of gets into the last chance saloon.
Yeah. Good advice. And same to students. I really wish that students would, I don't want to say not listen to their parents too much. Students should listen to their parents, but Also understand what you want out of this process. Think about not just what you want to be in the future, but what kind of a person you want to be, and think about what's important to you. What values do you care about? What do you really want to learn about in the world? And think about places that are going to help you do that, not just which place is going to give me the most money or which place is going to give me that job that I think I want because everyone else has told me. So really spend a bit of time thinking about yourself there. And that is, for all the fear that David and I have just put into you, that is one of the nice things about holistic applications in America, is that they are trying to work out what kind of a person are you? What is really your character and what do you really care about? And it's difficult being brought up in the UK from an early age to think just about how well you do in tests. And it's nice that someone is actually going to take the time to read an essay that you've written. So be honest with yourself and be honest with them.
Absolutely, yeah. Honesty in this is important, really is.
It really is. Just a little bit about us, our usual things. If anyone wants to book a free call with me or one of my colleagues, there's a free call link there. Lots more webinars and stuff coming up this time next week, or a bit earlier next week, 5 p.m. I think. I've got a webinar with Victor Thomas, who Director of International Admissions at Wash U, talking about what students should be doing in their summer. So great for students and parents. He might dispel some myths about how important things like internships and stuff are. And if anyone wants any courses or private tuition or anything like that for the SAT and ACT, please do let us know. There's our diagnostic test. We haven't talked about sports, maybe another time. David, do you want to say how people can get hold of you?
So David at theuniversityguys.com, or we're all over Instagram and Facebook and things like that at the University Guys. Or for be cheeky, email Jason and ask him to get us in touch. It's not like we don't speak about 18 times a day on various tools. So
exactly. Well, we've got a few minutes left, and it wouldn't be fair to end it without opening it up to questions. If anyone's got any questions, feel free to pop them in the Q&A, and David and I will answer them. One has come in straight away. A really nice long one here. So here's a last-minute college counselling question for you, David.
Well, it's a student that I know of. So Octavian, hello, nice to hear from you.
Oh, right. Is he getting some free help for you?
Octavian is if you don't mind me saying, Octavian is a student in the UK for the HMC Projects Organisation, who's part of our mentoring program that we do pro bono counselling with. So great questions there. Do you want to take them now and answer them live?
Yeah, I'll read them out, and we can see if we can answer them together. So this student is applying from the UK after the gap year because he got rejected from his first year applications, and he was wondering how big of a difference does the US see between an A star and an A? Great question in your A levels. He's aiming for 4 A stars, but he might also not get 4 A stars. That's quite usual. And second question is, how relevant are the grades across the year as a UK student? In the context, he's trying to improve his SAT from a 1440 to get a 1500. 1440 is a good score, so don't be too hard on yourself. He's also submitting SAT, not just A levels. Okay, a little bit to unpack here. How big a difference is it between an A star and an A, David, in your A levels?
Yeah, so it's going to be kind of depending on the level of university in general you're looking at. I know, I'll say you're looking at a certain level of university, and there's funding elements there as well. I tend to phrase all these questions using an analogy of a 100-meter race. If there are 100 people on the start line and the university's admit rate is a certain percentage, then you can work out how, in my analogy, it's 100 of you at the starting line, how many of you have to get across the line first. So it's all about competition. And so if you've got 4 A's, but somebody else has got 4 A stars, well, that person is probably further down the line than you are. And some questions I got asked my student earlier who's just got predicted grades, which aren't what she was hoping for. Well, can I compensate with extracurriculars? Well, you can do, but if there's 100 of you on the starting line and 50 of you can get in, then probably, yes, it will. Being slightly behind some people on grades, but ahead of them in extracurriculars will likely work. But if there's 100 of you on that starting line and only 3 of you can get in because it's a 3% admit rate, however good everything else is, there will still be people ahead of you because they have that and the thing that you're lacking. So 4A stars is better than 4As. I know that's simplistic, but it is. A lot of universities, the vast majority of US universities, not an issue. But at that very small elite group of places, and those ones which have a massive ton of funding to go with it, more A stars, the better.
Yeah. Now, one thing to caveat here is that if you're working really hard in school and your school predicts you 4A stars quite genuinely because they think that you're going to get 4A stars, and you miss out on one of those and get an A instead of an A star, that is probably not going to make much of a difference. That's a nice thing about America, is that they're judging you on what your whole profile is like at that time. And they know that, sometimes things go wrong and you don't quite get exactly what you want at the end. I should also be careful here that if you were predicted 4A stars, you end up with 4Bs, that's going to be a big problem. But as long as schools are being honest and predicting you accurate grades, then the predictions are the thing that's going to be judged at the point of application. That's relevant to your next question, which is about grades across the year. Now, you're talking here, I presume, about internal grades in the school and how well you've been doing in school in the run-up to your A-levels. Got to be a bit careful here, because schools sometimes, without knowing how it works, will submit all these kind of internal grades, mock exam results and stuff, and that is not always the most helpful thing to do. Now, David, I don't know if you're in touch with Octavian's school, but they probably, well, correct me if I'm wrong, I wouldn't recommend they submit internal grades.
And we'd say that for schools. UK schools, internal grades are probably not what should be submitted. Yes, we are. And well, we've got a great audience in here. Octavian's volunteer mentor is a little-known college counsellor called Jack Shull. A lot of people are going to go, well, you're in pretty good hands if Jack Shull is your volunteer university mentor. So I would also, as well as using me, obviously you've got Jack and indeed his son Christian involved in your corner as well. So yeah, we will advocate for that, for school not to send internal grades. And having final grades is incredible.
There's a few teachers on the call here, and we say this in our training all the time as well, is you could get pushback from universities who say, oh, would you mind expanding on these grades and send some internal grades? You should normally just say no and just say, listen, we do predictions at this time. That's what we do. Here are the GCSEs. Here are the predicted A levels. Final results come out in August. And it can feel a bit weird to push back against universities on that. But the problem is, if you start submitting internal grades, you've set a bit of a precedent. And the problem is that you probably know full well that how internal grades are measured is really different from school to school and even from subject to subject. So you could get one teacher being really accurate, saying, yep, he's on track for an A star, so these are my internal grades, and another subject teacher saying, well, he's at a B level at the moment, even if we might end up predicting him an A star. That's not very useful for the universities at all. So it's very hard to get that context across accurately, so you probably shouldn't do it. And even if a student's got fantastic internal grades all the way through school, by submitting it for that student means you might end up having to do it for other students, and that might not be the thing that you want to do. So generally stay away from that. Okay, doesn't look like there's any other questions here, so I think we'll draw it to a close there. I just want to say a big thanks to everyone who's attended, and David, thanks for giving up your time on a Wednesday night, and I'm sure I'll be texting you on Friday when the Ashes start.
Indeed. Always a pleasure, and lovely to see such nice people who've given up their time to join us. As we saying to everyone, indeed, the US's conference on Monday. If I don't get to see you, I wish everyone a really nice and restful summer, and we will see you again in crazy season back in September.
Thanks, David. Good night.
Thanks, Jason. Take care.